Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a Ukraine war news update concerning what took place in Istanbul yesterday with the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia and indeed other countries being present there too. The kind of TLDR, too long didn't read, conclusion would be nothing burger, not much has changed. Now's the time to whack some sanctions on Russia, but no doubt Trump will just think, well, okay, there'll be another Istanbul meeting maybe in a few weeks' time, 2 weeks. I'm pretty sure that he doesn't have the appetite to put sanctions on Russia. But it's interesting, there's been a slight movement on that with regard to his speaker, Mike Johnson. We're going to come to that later. There is an interesting development. I don't know that it'll make any difference at all. Right, so the second round of Ukraine-Russia talks end with a POW deal, but no ceasefire, which is the exact outcome of Istanbul 1.0. Just a few snippets here from this Guardian article. He said his negotiators, this is Zelensky, had given their Russian counterparts a list of nearly 400 abducted Ukrainian children that Kyiv wanted Moscow to return home, but that the Russian delegation agreed to work on only returning 10 of them. Ukrainian officials said that the focus of the prisoner exchange should be the wounded and the sick, as well as young soldiers between 18 and 25 years old. Russian officials confirmed that all sick and wounded prisoners would be swapped and that the exchange would involve at least 1,000 POWs. So that's what happened previously, 1,000 for 1,000. It's looking like that's going to happen again. But in terms of the major thrust of the negotiations, there were red lines on both sides that were never going to be agreed upon. At Monday's meeting in Istanbul, Ukrainian officials said that the Russians rejected Kyiv's call for an unconditional ceasefire of at least a month and had instead handed over a written proposal. We'll go through this in a second, which the Ukrainians said they would need more time to study before responding. My opinion is it was an outrageous list of, a list of outrageous proposals. They suggested the talks should reconvene towards the end of June. 2 weeks. In fact, that's even longer. The Russian state news agency RIA said that the Russian document proposed two options for a ceasefire, one of which would require Ukraine to begin a complete withdrawal of its troops from 4 of its regions occupied by Russia. RIA described the second option only as a package containing a number of unspecified conditions. Zelensky's repeatedly said he's ready to meet Putin, so that's another kind of recent development. And on Monday, Rustem Umerov, the defense minister, restated Kyiv's desire for a summit. Quote, "We believe that all the key issues can only be solved by the level of leaders with the possible involvement of other leaders such as the President of the United States," the defense minister said. Now, interesting that before we get on to this list of details, this is an interesting little nugget. So the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry was stating this on the absence of the Americans in Istanbul. It was a Russian demand that the American side not be present. I'm not quite sure what this means, to be honest. Quote, and this is from Foreign Ministry's spokesperson, Hiri Tiki, at the first meeting in Istanbul in May, the Russians insisted that the Americans not be present in the room. We don't understand why this is so critical for them. I don't either. In our view, the Americans should be involved. What they are trying to hide, that's a question for them. The same applies to the meeting as well. It was a Russian demand that the American side not be present. That's why the Turkish hosts are the only ones present. So although that there was engagement from other foreign delegates such as Germany, UK and Italy, they obviously weren't in the room. They were around the side sort of supporting and aligning rhetoric. But it's interesting. Why would the Russians not want the Americans there? Is it because they might see firsthand the intransigence of the Russians, and that could force Trump into being harsher with the Russians? So that if it comes from the Ukrainians, it just sounds like whinging, and it doesn't have the same, it doesn't impart the same kind of force as if the Americans saw firsthand the Russians not agreeing to anything. Okay. So Russia did propose a 2 to 3 day ceasefire, or a set of ceasefires in different places on the front line, in some areas of the front, to retrieve the bodies of the fallen, said Medinsky. According to a source in the president's office who spoke on condition of anonymity, Russia declined the ceasefire proposed by Ukraine. So 30-day ceasefire was off, but a number of 2 to 3 day ceasefires to retrieve bodies from the front line was proposed, but I don't think that was agreed to. In fact, the Russian media have published a Russian memorandum which was allegedly handed over to Ukraine at the talks in Istanbul, and this is what these pages state. So let's go through this. Translated here by Max25. So this is what the Russians demanded. And we need to work out whether this is at all realistic, whether it was worth having a meeting, since if they were too unrealistic, these proposals, then they're going to be rejected out of hand, in which case this is just a delaying tactic to wait for another meeting at the end of June. I think that's a likely explanation, right? The complete withdrawal of the AFU from DPR, LPR, so Donetsk, Luhansk People's Republics, Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, including Donbas and Novorossiya, must be carried out within 30 days of a ceasefire. So there has to be a ceasefire, and when there is, the Ukrainians get out of Dodge. Russians don't. Ukrainians get out of Dodge. International recognition of Crimea, Donbas, and Novorossiya as part of Russia. That's never going to happen. Neutrality of Ukraine. That's never going to happen. Holding you could see them agree to some form of neutrality, but it would require all sorts of assistance from international forces. Holding elections in Ukraine, followed by the signing of a peace treaty. A ban on the redeployment of armed forces in Ukraine, with the exception of movements for the withdrawal of troops. A ban on the reception and deployment of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. A ban on the supply of Western weapons and intelligence. A waiver of mutual claims in connection with the damage caused in hostilities. A waiver of mutual claims in connection with the damage caused in hostilities. I presume that means they can't ask for reparations. Is that the this seems like a list, and that's just a small selection of what was demanded. The list appears completely unrealistic. So of course Ukraine are not going to agree to any of that. Really, Russian media shared a peace memo demanding full Ukrainian troop withdrawal from occupied regions, recognition of Crimea and Donbas as Russian, Ukraine's neutrality, elections, no redeployment of troops, no nuclear weapons, and a ban on Western arms supplies. It ain't going to happen. So we're back to square one, but with a POW exchange thrown in, which is obviously good news, but this is not otherwise a meaningful outcome for these negotiations, and it just looks like a massive waste of time again. Now, Zelensky has explicitly called the Russians arrogant in exchange here. So the Russian side said that Ukraine threatened their lives. I'm honestly surprised. I'm sure that our people behaved correctly. I understand that they get a call after the first meeting, or wherever they get a call, I don't know, and someone is threatening them. There are relevant statements, I was told about it, so to be honest, I'm surprised by such messages. And as for the threats from the Russian side, he says, it's hopeless, and the delegation, as I was told, behaved more calmly than it had been. He stated there. But at the end he says, but the impudence. So fairly harsh words for the Russians. Actually, here's a slightly longer iteration of that exchange, where he says, and the delegation, as I was told, behaved more calmly than it had been, but the impudence, so the arrogance. It is what it is, and it is. He continues, impudent people, but they behaved a little more modestly. We'll see. Maybe we need a couple more measures, and they will try to behave like people. So that's pretty critical of the Russians there. but it's hard not to be when they come out with these. I mean, they are arrogant demands, aren't they? Just absolutely no desire to meet Ukraine anywhere in the middle. And Ukraine's demands that we went through previously were actually really reasonable proposals. Now, okay, the outcome is nothing burger. We'll have to wait to see what the Americans will do. And will they do anything? Well, it's then very interesting to learn that Andriy Yermak, the head of the presidential office, essentially people recognize him as being the most powerful person in Ukraine. He is kind of the guy behind Zelensky, if you like. Now, he has flown this morning to the US. So the purpose of the visit remains undisclosed. We have a potential that it is involving... so I did have a little bit more detail on that. And here we have it from the Kyiv Independent. Ukrainian delegation arrives in the US to discuss defense support and Russian sanctions. So remember that Richard Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham have been to Kyiv to talk about these kind of 500% tariffs that they're put on Russia if they weren't going to play ball from a congressional point of view. And that's what we've been waiting for, saying all the right things with regard to the US giving aid to Ukraine, supporting Ukraine and hammering the crap out of Russia, then going to meet Ursula von der Leyen and Europeans in EU Europeans to discuss doing this kind of activity in conjunction with the Europeans. And I think coming away from that meeting very buoyed by the European response. But it's all about Trump, right? So then going back to the United States. So the question is, will that pass through Congress? Will it be signed off by Trump? And this is where we're at. So the delegation, the Ukrainian delegation, is obviously going to be over there looking at making sure that that takes place. The delegation will discuss, quote, defense support, the battlefield situation, and strengthening sanctions against Russia, namely Senator Lindsey Graham's bill, Andriy Yermak has said. So that's what they are looking to do. Then we have news of US House Speaker Mike Johnson. So remember, Mike Johnson was a guy that held back the aid to Ukraine for 7 months on behest of Trump, but his rhetoric has always actually been pretty pro-Ukrainian or anti-Russian. So what you have with him is this desire to appease their leader over and above anything else. So he kowtows in light of demands from Trump, right? Kowtows to Trump, but he doesn't have the strength, hitherto at least, to push through in accordance with his conscience, right? To push through action into Congress. So he didn't table the bill, and I know tabling the bill means a different thing in the UK as it does in the US. That means to put forward a bill in British talk. So he didn't put forward that bill for 7 months because Trump. But here he's now kind of speaking his mind, I think, more freely. US House Speaker Mike Johnson backs the toughest possible sanctions on Russia, telling the New York Post, which is a Murdoch tabloid, but is actually very pro-Ukraine, the New York Post. Quote, many in Congress want sanctions against Russia as strongly as we can, and I'm an advocate of that. Well, we'll believe it when we see it, says a commenter, and absolutely, he's only as good as he's allowed to be by Trump. But that's what we want to hear from the House Speaker, because it will have to go through both houses. So although there's a clear bipartisan support with 82 senators sponsoring the bill that's the Lindsey Graham Richard Blumenthal bill for sanctions, it's another thing, garnering that much support, bipartisan support in the House of Representatives. However, assuming that all the Democrats would go for it, you would only need a few to cross the aisle. And it's not really crossing the aisle anyway. This is something that politicians on both sides should welcome, being hard on Russia in light of the war in Ukraine. But that is good news. So Phillips O'Brien says, it's remarkable how protective Trump is being of Russia. Now Speaker Johnson has publicly admitted that he wants the toughest possible sanctions on Russia. The Senate has a strong majority in favor. However, Trump refuses to act, and that's kind of where we're at. Still, will he finally get to a point where enough is enough and the Russians haven't played ball? Or will we get even more evidence, should we actually need any, that Trump is not at all interested and never has been interested in pressuring Russia in any meaningful way? So then the Russians will agree to a third round of talks with the Ukraine under two conditions, according to the First Deputy Chairman of the State Duma Committee on International Affairs. According to Alexei Chepa, these are the absence of new attacks such as the blowing up of railway bridges in the Russian rear and strikes on strategic aviation airfields, and compliance with the 2 to 3 day ceasefire proposed by Russia on certain sections of the front. So now Russia are coming back to the Ukrainians and saying, almost trying to take back control and signal to Trump, maybe, that, hey, look, we want ceasefires. We've asked for 2 to 3 day ceasefires on different sections of the front. And we want the Ukrainians not to attack us where they keep hurting us, because that's not very nice. Meanwhile, this morning, the Russians have sent a Kinzhal dagger missile into Mykolaiv, and they've hit Sumy, in the middle of Sumy, killing people, civilians. So the Russians can go about killing Ukrainian civilians, but we can't have another round of talks until you stop hitting our military targets. Just absolute insanity from the Russians. But if that gets any purchase in the Trump administration, then that will be, well, that'll give you the final indication, if you need it, that the Trump administration is doing everything it can to support Russia. I mean, this should lead the Americans to come down heavily on the Russians. It should lead to the Blumenthal and Graham bill to get through Congress and hopefully get signed off by the president. But we shall see. Anyway, that's my analysis. I hope it was useful. Take care. Speak to you soon.